In the early autumn of 2021, two sisters from Portland, Oregon embarked on what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. 27-year-old Nina Harlow and her 29-year-old sister Rebecca Harlow were experienced hikers who had grown up exploring the trails of the Pacific Northwest. They informed their mother that they would be camping near the Lewis River Trail, a moderately trafficked route known for its waterfalls and dense evergreen canopy. The sisters planned to return by Sunday evening, September 12th, but when Monday morning arrived and neither of them showed up for work, their mother called the Skamania County Sheriff's Office to report them missing. What followed was one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, a case that began with a routine search and ended with a discovery so unusual that investigators struggled to explain how two women could vanish for 3 months and be found alive, unconscious, and tied to a tree in the middle of the wilderness. The morning of September 10, 2021, was cool and overcast, typical weather for early fall in southwestern Washington. According to the parking attendant stationed at the Lewis River trailhead, a silver Honda CR-V pulled into the lot at approximately 8:30 in the morning. Two women exited the vehicle, both wearing hiking boots, daypack backpacks, and rain jackets. The attendant later confirmed during his official testimony that the sisters appeared relaxed and well prepared. They signed the visitor log at the information kiosk, noting their intended route as a 2-day loop that would take them along the lower Lewis River Trail and connect to a series of smaller paths leading to several backcountry campsites. Their signatures were clear and their handwriting was steady. There was no indication of hesitation or concern. According to the plan, they left with their mother. Nina and Rebecca intended to camp near Bolt Creek, a quiet area several miles into the forest where the trail narrows and the tree cover becomes especially thick. The area is not heavily visited, even during peak season, which made it attractive to experienced campers looking for solitude. Their mother, Patricia Harlow, later stated in her official report that both daughters were cautious and responsible. They always carried extra food, a first aid kit, and a satellite communication device for emergencies. This detail would become important later because the device was never activated. On the evening of September 10th, Patricia received a brief text message from Rebecca stating that they had arrived at the campsite and that the weather was holding up. The message was sent at 6:47 in the evening, according to cell tower records provided by the mobile carrier. That was the last communication anyone received from either sister. By Sunday evening, Patricia expected her daughters to return home. When she did not hear from them by 9 o'clock at night, she sent several text messages. None were delivered. She called both phones repeatedly, but each call went directly to voicemail. This was unusual but not immediately alarming. Cell service in the Gifford-Pinchot area is unreliable at best, and it was not uncommon for hikers to lose signal for extended periods. However, when Monday morning came and neither Nina nor Rebecca showed up for work, Patricia's concern turned to fear. Nina worked as a graphic designer for a marketing firm in Portland, and Rebecca was a kindergarten teacher at a local elementary school. Both were known for their punctuality and professionalism. Their employers confirmed that neither woman had requested time off beyond the weekend, and both had important commitments scheduled for Monday. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Patricia drove to the Skamania County Sheriff's Office and filed a formal missing persons report. The case was assigned to Deputy Lawrence Finch, a veteran officer with more than 15 years of experience in search and rescue operations. Finch reviewed the information provided by Patricia, including the sisters' intended route, their last known location, and the timeline of their communications. He immediately noted that the lack of activity on the satellite device was concerning. If the sisters had encountered trouble, the device was designed to send an automatic distress signal. The fact that no such signal had been sent suggested either that they had not perceived themselves to be in danger, or that something had prevented them from using the device. The search began the following morning, September 14th, at first light. A team of forest rangers, search and rescue volunteers, and a K-9 unit assembled at the Lewis River trailhead. The operation was coordinated by the Skamania County Sheriff's Office in partnership with the United States Forest Service. According to the official operation log, the first objective was to retrace the sisters' planned route and locate their campsite near Bolt Creek. The weather on the day of the search was clear, which allowed the helicopter team to conduct aerial surveys of the surrounding terrain. However, the dense canopy made it difficult to see the ground in most areas. The forest in this region is composed primarily of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and red cedar, with an understory of ferns, salal, and vine maple. Visibility from above was limited to clearings, riverbanks, and rocky outcroppings. The ground teams moved methodically along the trail, checking for signs of recent activity. Footprints, discarded wrappers, broken branches, anything that might indicate the sisters had passed through. By midday, the team reached the area near Bolt Creek where the Harlow sisters were believed to have camped. They found a clearing that showed signs of recent use. A fire ring with charred wood, flattened sections of ground where a tent might have been pitched, and several small impressions in the dirt that could have been left by hiking boots. However, there was no tent, no backpacks, and no other camping equipment. The forensic team that later examined the site noted in their report that the fire ring appeared to have been used within the past few days, but the wood was cold and damp, suggesting that no fire had been lit recently. The search expanded outward from the campsite in a grid pattern. Volunteers combed through the undergrowth, calling out the sisters' names and listening for any response. The K-9 units picked up a scent trail leading away from the clearing, but it dissipated after a few hundred yards near a rocky slope where the terrain became difficult to navigate. Over the next several days, the search area was widened to include adjacent trails, creek beds, and abandoned logging roads. Divers were brought in to search sections of the Lewis River where the current was slow enough to allow for submersion. Nothing was found. No clothing, no equipment, no traces of the sisters. By the end of the first week, more than 200 volunteers had participated in the search. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, and the Harlow family issued public appeals for information. Photographs of Nina and Rebecca were distributed to nearby towns, campgrounds, and ranger stations. The sisters were described as friendly, experienced hikers who would not have taken unnecessary risks. The lack of any tangible leads was frustrating for everyone involved. On September 21st, 11 days after the sisters were last seen, the active search was officially scaled back. The Skamania County Sheriff's Office issued a statement explaining that while the case remained open, the deployment of large search teams was no longer sustainable without new information. The family was devastated, but they understood the limitations of the resources available. Deputy Finch assured them that the investigation would continue and that any new evidence would be pursued immediately. Weeks turned into months. The case file remained on Finch's desk, but there were no new developments. The Honda CR-V was still parked at the trailhead, untouched and undisturbed. Investigators had searched the vehicle thoroughly, finding nothing unusual. Personal items, spare clothes, a cooler with melted ice, and a road map with the route to the trailhead highlighted in yellow. Everything suggested a normal, planned trip. As October gave way to November, the forest began to change. The leaves turned gold and red, then fell. The temperature dropped, and the first light snows dusted the higher elevations. The Harlow family continued their own search efforts, organizing weekend expeditions with friends and volunteers. They posted flyers, maintained a social media page dedicated to finding Nina and Rebecca, and contacted every outdoor group and hiking club in the region. But the forest offered no answers. It was as if the sisters had simply vanished into the trees, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of dread. 3 months passed in silence. Winter settled over the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest with a heavy blanket of snow that made most trails impassable. The search for Nina and Rebecca Harlow had gone cold, not just in terms of leads but literally. The temperatures in December 2021 regularly dropped below freezing, and the forest became a place that only the most experienced winter hikers dared to enter. The Skamania County Sheriff's Office kept the case file active, but with no new information and no credible sightings, there was little that could be done until the spring thaw. Deputy Lawrence Finch reviewed the file periodically, hoping that something new would surface, but each review ended the same way with more questions than answers. The Harlow family refused to give up hope. Patricia Harlow spent her days coordinating with missing persons organizations, consulting with private investigators, and reaching out to psychics and volunteers who claimed they could help. She posted updates on social media every week, keeping the story alive in the public consciousness. Rebecca's students at the elementary school made drawings and cards that were displayed in the front office, each one a small prayer for her safe return. Nina's co-workers held a candlelight vigil in downtown Portland, drawing attention from local media and keeping pressure on authorities to continue the search. But as December turned into January, Even the most optimistic supporters began to fear the worst. The chances of surviving 3 months in the wilderness, especially during winter, were extraordinarily slim. Hypothermia, starvation, exposure, wild animals, the list of dangers was long and unforgiving. Some volunteers quietly stopped attending the search meetings. Some family friends began to speak in past tense when referring to the sisters. The unspoken consensus was that Nina and Rebecca were gone, and that when spring came, the forest would give up their remains. But the forest had other plans. On the morning of December 14, 2021, a wildlife biologist named Gordon Pace was conducting a routine survey of elk migration patterns in a remote section of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. His work required him to travel off-trail into areas that were rarely visited by the public. He was equipped with GPS tracking equipment, a camera with a telephoto lens, and several days' worth of supplies. According to his official report, he had been walking through a dense section of old-growth forest roughly 4 miles northeast of the Lewis River Trail when he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it was a pair of mannequins. 2 figures standing upright against a massive Douglas fir tree, their bodies motionless, their heads slumped forward. The scene was so strange and out of place that Pace initially assumed it was some kind of art installation or a prank left behind by other hikers. But as he approached, the details became clearer and more disturbing. The figures were not mannequins. They were human. 2 women, both dressed in heavily soiled and torn clothing, were bound to the tree with thick nylon rope. Their arms were pulled behind them, wrapped around the trunk, and secured tightly. Their legs were similarly bound at the ankles and knees, preventing any movement. Both women appeared unconscious, their heads hanging forward, their hair matted and filthy. Their faces were streaked with dirt, their skin pale and chapped from exposure. Their clothing, which had once been functional hiking gear, was now little more than rags. Pace stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. For a moment he could not process what he was seeing. Then training took over. He pulled out his satellite phone and immediately dialed emergency services. His voice, according to the transcript of the call, was shaking but clear. He reported his exact GPS coordinates, described what he had found, and emphasized that the 2 women appeared to be alive but unresponsive. The dispatcher instructed him to approach carefully and check for vital signs, but not to untie them until help arrived. Pace moved closer, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the neck of the nearest woman. He felt a pulse. It was faint and irregular, but it was there. He checked the second woman and found the same. Both were alive. Barely, but alive. He stepped back, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what he was witnessing. These women had been missing for 3 months. It was the middle of winter. The temperature that morning was just above freezing, and the nights regularly dropped well below. There was no shelter, no fire, no visible source of food or water. And yet, somehow they were still breathing. The emergency response was immediate. A helicopter was dispatched from the nearest ranger station, and a ground team was assembled to reach Pace's location. The terrain was difficult, covered in snow and thick underbrush, but the coordinates provided by Pace allowed the teams to navigate directly to the site. Within 90 minutes, the first responders arrived. The scene that greeted them was one that none of them would ever forget. The 2 women were still tied to the tree, their bodies slack and unresponsive. Their clothing was in tatters, exposing skin that was covered in bruises, scratches, and what appeared to be insect bites. Their hair was tangled and matted with dirt, leaves, and what looked like dried mud. Their hands and feet were swollen and discolored, likely from poor circulation caused by the tight bindings. One of the paramedics, a woman named Jennifer Whitmore, later described the scene in her official statement. She said that the sisters looked like they had been through a war. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken, their lips cracked and bleeding. But what struck her most was the position of their bodies. Despite being unconscious, both women were still standing upright, held in place only by the ropes. It was as if someone had carefully arranged them to remain that way, even as they lost consciousness. The paramedics worked quickly. They checked vital signs, administered 4 fluids, and carefully cut the ropes binding the women to the tree. As the bindings were removed, both women collapsed into the arms of the responders. They were immediately placed on stretchers and prepared for airlift. The helicopter transported them to Legacy Salmon Creek Medical Center in Vancouver, Washington, where a trauma team was standing by. The initial medical assessment was shocking. Both Nina and Rebecca were severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from hypothermia. Their core body temperatures were dangerously low, hovering just above the threshold for life-threatening complications. They had lost significant body weight, with estimates suggesting they had each dropped between 30 and 40 pounds. Their muscle mass had deteriorated, and their skin showed signs of prolonged exposure to the elements. But the most alarming finding was the evidence of restraint injuries. Deep ligature marks encircled their wrists, ankles, and torsos, indicating that they had been bound for an extended period. The marks were consistent with nylon rope, the same type that had been used to tie them to the tree. The medical team also noted the presence of pressure sores and skin breakdown in areas where the ropes had been tightest, suggesting that the bindings had not been removed or adjusted for days, possibly weeks. Despite their condition, both women were alive. Their bodies had somehow endured 3 months of exposure, starvation, and restraint. The doctors could not explain it. One physician later remarked in a case conference that the human body is capable of extraordinary resilience, but what these women had survived defied medical understanding. They should not have been alive, and yet they were. News of the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, local and national media outlets were reporting that the missing Harlow sisters had been found alive in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The story dominated headlines not just because they had survived, but because of the bizarre and disturbing circumstances of their discovery. Questions immediately arose. Who had tied them to the tree? Why had they been left in such a remote location? How had they survived for 3 months without food, water, or shelter? And perhaps most unsettling, why were they still unconscious when they were found? The Skamania County Sheriff's Office launched an immediate investigation. Deputy Finch, who had been the lead investigator on the missing persons case, was assigned to coordinate the criminal investigation. The case was no longer just about finding 2 missing hikers. It was now a potential abduction, assault, and attempted murder. The site where the sisters were found was treated as a crime scene. Forensic teams were dispatched to document every detail. Photographers captured the tree, the ropes, the surrounding area, and any potential evidence left behind. The ropes were collected and sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Soil samples were taken from the base of the tree. Footprints in the snow were measured and photographed. Every piece of physical evidence was cataloged and preserved. One of the most significant findings was a set of boot prints leading away from the tree. The prints were distinct, with a heavy tread pattern that suggested work boots or hiking boots. They led northeast, deeper into the forest, before disappearing into a rocky area where the ground was too hard to hold impressions. The forensic team followed the trail as far as they could, but it eventually went cold. Whoever had left those prints knew how to move through the forest without leaving a trace. The investigation into what had happened to Nina and Rebecca Harlow during their 3 months in the wilderness began in earnest as soon as the crime scene was secured. Deputy Lawrence Finch coordinated with the forensic teams, medical personnel, and Forest Service officials to piece together a timeline of events. But the most important source of information, the sisters themselves, remained unavailable. Both women were still unconscious, their bodies fighting to recover from the extreme trauma they had endured. The doctors at Legacy Salmon Creek Medical Center worked around the clock to stabilize them, but bringing someone back from the edge of death was a delicate process that could not be rushed. According to the medical reports filed in the days following their admission, Nina and Rebecca were suffering from a combination of severe dehydration, malnutrition, hypothermia, and what the attending physician described as profound physical and psychological shock. Their vital signs were weak but stable. 4 fluids were administered continuously to rehydrate their bodies, and warming blankets were used to slowly raise their core temperatures. Blood tests revealed dangerously low levels of electrolytes, vitamins, and proteins, consistent with prolonged starvation. Their bodies had begun to consume their own muscle tissue in a desperate attempt to survive. The restraint injuries were examined in detail. The ligature marks on their wrists and ankles were deep and discolored, with some areas showing signs of infection. The medical team treated these wounds with antibiotics and specialized dressings, but the damage suggested that the bindings had been in place for weeks, possibly the entire duration of their captivity. The pressure sores on their backs and sides indicated that they had been in a standing or semi-standing position for extended periods, unable to sit or lie down. One of the trauma nurses, a man named Paul Becker, later stated in his testimony that he had never seen anything like it. "The human body is not designed to remain upright and restrained for that long," he said. "The fact that they survived it at all is nothing short of a miracle." On the third day after their rescue, December 17th, Rebecca Harlow began to show signs of regaining consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered and she made faint movements with her fingers. The medical staff immediately notified Deputy Finch, who had been waiting at the hospital for any opportunity to speak with the sisters. However, the doctors warned him that Rebecca was not yet in a condition to be interviewed. Her brain function was still compromised, and any attempt to question her prematurely could cause further harm. Finch agreed to wait, but he remained at the hospital, ready to act the moment the doctors gave him clearance. 2 days later, on December 19th, Rebecca fully regained consciousness. She opened her eyes, looked around the room, and began to cry. The nurses comforted her, explaining that she was safe and that her sister was in the next room. Rebecca's first words, according to the nursing notes, were a whisper. "Where is he?" The question sent a chill through everyone in the room. The nurses asked her to clarify, but Rebecca became agitated, her heart rate spiking on the monitor. The medical team administered a mild sedative to calm her, and she drifted back into a light sleep. But those 3 words had already set the investigation on a new course. There was a he. Someone had done this to them. And whoever he was still out there. Nina regained consciousness the following day. Her awakening was less dramatic than her sister's, but no less emotional. She opened her eyes, stared at the ceiling for several minutes, and then turned her head to see the nurses standing beside her. She did not speak at first, but tears streamed down her face. When the nurses asked her how she was feeling, she nodded weakly and whispered that she was thirsty. They gave her small sips of water and assured her that she was in a hospital and that she was safe. Like her sister, Nina's first question was about Rebecca. When she was told that Rebecca was alive and recovering in the next room, Nina closed her eyes and sobbed quietly. On December 21st, 10 days after they were found, both sisters were deemed stable enough to be interviewed by law enforcement. Deputy Finch, along with a female detective named Laura Grimshaw, entered Rebecca's room first. The interview was conducted with a counselor present, as both women were considered vulnerable witnesses. The session was recorded on video, and a transcript was later entered into the case file. Rebecca was sitting up in bed, her arms wrapped in bandages, her face still pale and drawn. She looked at the detectives with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Finch began gently, asking her to describe what she remembered from the day she and her sister went missing. Rebecca spoke slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained that on the evening of September 10th, she and Nina had set up camp near Bolt Creek, just as they had planned. They cooked dinner over a small portable stove, talked about their week, and watched the sun set through the trees. Everything was normal. They went to sleep around 10 o'clock at night, zipped into their tent, with no sense that anything was wrong. Rebecca paused, her hands trembling. She said that sometime in the middle of the night, she was woken by the sound of the tent zipper being pulled open. At first, she thought it was Nina getting up to use the bathroom, but then she realized that Nina was still lying next to her, also waking up. Before either of them could react, a bright flashlight beam flooded the tent, blinding them. A man's voice, calm and quiet, told them not to scream. Rebecca said she could not see his face because of the light, but she could see his silhouette. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he was holding something in his other hand. It looked like a knife. The man ordered them to get out of the tent slowly. Rebecca and Nina complied, too frightened to resist. Once they were outside, the man used zip ties to bind their hands behind their backs. He worked quickly and efficiently as if he had done this before. He did not speak except to give them instructions. Do not run. Do not scream. Do not look at me. He then forced them to walk. Rebecca could not say exactly how far they went because it was dark and she was disoriented, but she estimated it was at least an hour, maybe more. They walked through the forest, stumbling over roots and rocks, with the man following close behind. At one point, Nina tried to ask him what he wanted, but he told her to be quiet. His tone was not angry, Rebecca said. It was worse than that. It was emotionless, like he did not care about them at all. Eventually, they arrived at a clearing where the man had set up what Rebecca described as a makeshift camp. There was a tarp stretched between 2 trees, a pile of supplies, and a large backpack. He made them sit on the ground while he prepared more restraints. This time he used nylon rope, the same kind that would later be found binding them to the tree. He tied their ankles, their knees, and then looped the rope around their torsos, securing them to nearby trees so they could not move. Rebecca's voice broke as she described what happened next. The man did not hurt them physically, at least not in the way she had feared. He did not assault them. He did not beat them. But he kept them there, tied up day after day. He gave them small amounts of water, just enough to keep them alive. Sometimes he gave them pieces of dried fruit or crackers, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. He barely spoke to them. When he did, it was only to tell them to stay quiet or to stop struggling. Rebecca said that she and Nina tried to reason with him, tried to ask him why he was doing this, but he never answered. He just stared at them with a blank expression, as if they were objects rather than people. Days turned into weeks. Rebecca lost track of time. The man moved them twice, each time to a new location deeper in the forest. He was careful to cover his tracks, to choose places where they would not be found. He checked the ropes regularly, tightening them whenever they loosened. He never let them sit or lie down for long. Most of the time, they were forced to remain standing, leaning against the trees for support. The pain was unbearable, Rebecca said. Their muscles cramped. Their joints ached. Their skin chafed and bled where the ropes dug in. They begged him to let them rest, but he refused. He seemed to want them to suffer, but in a controlled, deliberate way. He never let them die, but he never let them be comfortable either. As the weeks went on, Rebecca said that she and Nina began to lose hope. They stopped talking to each other because it took too much energy. They stopped struggling because it was pointless. They just existed, waiting for something to change. And then, one day, the man moved them to the final location, the tree where they would eventually be found. He tied them more securely than ever before, wrapping the ropes around the trunk so tightly that they could barely breathe. And then he left. Rebecca did not know how long he was gone. Hours, maybe days. Time had lost all meaning. She remembered feeling herself getting weaker, her vision blurring, her thoughts becoming confused. She remembered Nina whispering that she loved her, and then everything went black. The next thing she knew, she was waking up in the hospital. Deputy Finch listened to Rebecca's account in silence, his face grim. When she finished, he asked her if she could describe the man. Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to recall details. She said he was white, probably in his 40s or 50s. He had a thick beard, dark but streaked with gray. He wore a heavy jacket, cargo pants, and work boots. His voice was deep and flat, with no accent that she could detect. But the most distinctive thing about him, she said, was his eyes. They were cold. Empty. Like he was not really there. Nina's account, recorded the following day in a separate interview, matched her sister's testimony in almost every detail. She described the same sequence of events, the same terrifying night when they were taken from their tent, the same methodical cruelty of their captor. But Nina added details that Rebecca either had not noticed or had been too traumatized to recall. According to Nina, the man who abducted them seemed to know the forest intimately. He moved through the darkness without hesitation, never using a map or GPS, never stumbling or losing his way. He knew where he was going at all times, which suggested that he had spent significant time in the area, possibly years. Nina also noted that the man carried very little with him. No large camping equipment, no vehicle that she ever saw or heard. Everything he had fit into a single large backpack and a smaller waist pack. He was completely self-sufficient, living off the land in a way that indicated either military training or extensive wilderness experience. During the first few days of their captivity, Nina said she tried to memorize landmarks, hoping that if they ever escaped, she could lead rescuers back to where they had been held. But the man seemed aware of this. Every few days he would move them to a new location, always deeper into the forest, always farther from any trail or road. Each time he covered their tracks meticulously, brushing away footprints, breaking branches to disguise the path, and choosing routes that passed over rock or hard ground where tracks would not show. Nina recalled one specific moment that stood out to her. It was during the second week, she thought, though she could not be certain. The man had just finished tightening the ropes around her wrists, and she was in so much pain that she could not stop herself from crying. She asked him, through her tears, why he was doing this. What did he want from them? The man paused, looked at her with those empty eyes, and said something that chilled her to the bone. He said, "I just wanted to see how long you would last." Nina told the detectives that in that moment, she understood that this was not about ransom or revenge or any rational motive. It was an experiment to him. They were test subjects. He was studying their suffering the way a scientist might observe rats in a cage. And that realization was more terrifying than anything else, because it meant there was no reasoning with him, no appealing to his humanity. He did not see them as human. As the interviews continued over the next several days, both sisters provided additional fragments of information. They described the man's routine. He would check on them twice a day, usually in the early morning and late evening. He would give them water from a canteen, sometimes just a few sips, sometimes half a cup. The food he provided was minimal: dried fruit, crackers, once a piece of jerky. Never enough to sustain them, but just enough to keep them alive. He never built a fire, never cooked food, never did anything that might attract attention. He was a ghost, moving through the forest without leaving a trace. Rebecca mentioned that on several occasions she heard distant voices, hikers or search parties calling out names. Once, she was certain she heard a helicopter overhead. Each time, she and Nina tried to scream, but the man had gagged them with strips of cloth whenever he sensed anyone nearby. He would stand perfectly still, watching the forest, waiting until the sounds faded away. Then he would remove the gags and continue as if nothing had happened. Nina also described the psychological torment. The man rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always to remind them of their helplessness. He told them that no one was looking for them anymore. He said that their family had given up, that the search had been called off, that they had been forgotten. Nina said she tried not to believe him, but as the days stretched into weeks and then months, doubt crept in. Maybe he was right. Maybe no one was coming. The physical deterioration was slow but relentless. Both sisters described how their bodies began to shut down. Their muscles weakened, their skin became covered in sores, their hair fell out in clumps. They stopped menstruating. Their teeth became loose. They could feel themselves dying bit by bit, but the process was so gradual that there was no single moment when they could say, "This is the end." It was just a long, agonizing fade. And then, in what they believed were their final days, the man changed his pattern. Instead of moving them again, he brought them to the large Douglas fir tree and tied them in a way that was different from before. The ropes were tighter, more permanent. He wrapped them around the trunk multiple times, securing their arms, legs, and torso so completely that they could not move at all. He stepped back, looked at them for a long moment, and then walked away. That was the last time they saw him. Nina said she remembered thinking that this was it, that he had decided to let them die. She remembered her vision going dark, her thoughts scattering, and then nothing. The next thing she knew, she was waking up in a hospital bed. The testimonies provided by Nina and Rebecca gave investigators a clear picture of what had happened, but they also raised urgent questions. Who was this man? Where was he now? And why had he abandoned the sisters at the end instead of finishing what he had started? Deputy Finch assembled a task force that included detectives from the Skamania County Sheriff's Office, agents from the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit, and forensic specialists from the Washington State Patrol. The case was now classified as aggravated kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. The fact that the suspect had held 2 women captive for 3 months in a national forest made it a federal case as well, which brought additional resources and expertise to the investigation. The first priority was to identify the suspect. The physical description provided by the sisters was detailed enough to create a composite sketch. A forensic artist worked with both Nina and Rebecca separately, and the resulting images were remarkably consistent. The man was estimated to be between 45 and 55 years old, white, with a heavy build, a thick dark beard streaked with gray and deep-set eyes. He was approximately 6 feet tall and had a weathered, sun-damaged complexion consistent with someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors. The composite sketch was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest, posted on social media, and featured on local and national news programs. Tips began to come in almost immediately, but most were either vague or based on individuals who had alibis or did not match the description closely enough. One promising lead came from a retired forest ranger named Donald Kemper, who contacted the tip line after seeing the sketch on the evening news. Kemper said that the man in the drawing looked familiar. He believed it might be someone he had encountered several times over the years in the Gifford-Pinchot area, a man who lived off the grid and avoided contact with other people. Kemper described this individual as a survivalist type, someone who moved through the forest like he owned it, who never registered with the Park Service, and who seemed to resent the presence of other hikers. Kemper could not remember the man's name, but he recalled that he drove an old pickup truck, dark green or gray, and that he had once mentioned living somewhere in the backcountry near the Wind River drainage. This information was passed to the investigative team, and a search of vehicle registration records in the region was initiated. Analysts cross-referenced the description with known individuals who had previous contacts with law enforcement in the area, focusing on those with records of trespassing, poaching, or other violations related to public lands. Within 2 days, a name surfaced. His name was Vincent Lowell, a 52-year-old man with a sparse but telling criminal history. Lowell had been cited multiple times for illegal camping, trespassing in restricted areas, and hunting out of season. He had no permanent address on record, but his last known location was listed as a rural route near the town of Carson, Washington, about 20 miles south of the area where the sisters had been found. His vehicle registration matched the description provided by Kemper, a 1998 Chevrolet Silverado, dark green with Washington plates. More importantly, Lowell's physical appearance matched the composite sketch almost perfectly. His driver's license photo, taken 6 years earlier, showed a man with a heavy beard, deep-set eyes, and a hardened expression. He was listed as 6 feet 1 inch tall and 210 pounds. The resemblance was striking enough that Deputy Finch immediately elevated Lowell to the top of the suspect list. A background check revealed additional concerning details. Lowell had served in the United States Army in the early 1990s, with a specialty in field reconnaissance. He had been honorably discharged, but his service record noted several disciplinary actions for insubordination and failure to follow protocol. After leaving the military, he had worked sporadically in construction and logging, but there was no record of steady employment after 2015. He appeared to have dropped off the grid entirely, living a transient lifestyle in the forests of southern Washington. Investigators obtained a warrant to search any property or vehicles associated with Vincent Lowell. The challenge was finding him. He had no phone, no email, no social media presence, and no utility bills. He was a man who existed almost entirely outside the modern world. The search focused on the area near Carson, where Lowell's truck had last been registered. Deputies canvassed the rural roads, showing his photo to residents and asking if anyone had seen him recently. Several people recognized him. One woman said he used to park his truck on a dirt turnout near the Wind River and hike into the woods for weeks at a time. A gas station attendant recalled selling him fuel and supplies a few months earlier, but could not remember exactly when. On December 27, 2021, a break in the case came from an unexpected source. A postal worker named Amanda Briggs, who serviced the rural routes near Carson, called the tip line after seeing Vincent Lowell's photograph on the news. She told investigators that she had seen a man matching his description just 3 days earlier, on December 24, Christmas Eve. He had been walking along Forest Road 43, a remote gravel road that led deep into the backcountry. She remembered him clearly because it was unusual to see anyone on foot in that area, especially in winter. Briggs said the man was carrying a large backpack and walking away from the main road, heading toward the forest. She had slowed down as she passed him, thinking he might need help, but he had waved her off without making eye contact. She noted that he had a thick beard and was wearing heavy outdoor clothing. When she saw his photo on the news, she was certain it was the same person. Deputy Finch immediately organized a search operation focused on Forest Road 43 and the surrounding wilderness. A team of deputies, Forest Service officers, and FBI agents assembled at the trailhead early on the morning of December 28. The area was remote, heavily forested, and covered in snow. The temperature was well below freezing, and visibility was limited by the thick canopy overhead. The team moved cautiously, aware that if Lowell was indeed in the area, he would have the advantage of knowing the terrain far better than they did. Search dogs were brought in to track any scent, and a drone equipped with thermal imaging was deployed to scan the forest for heat signatures. The ground team followed a series of faint tracks in the snow that led away from the road and into a dense section of old-growth timber. After nearly 3 hours of careful tracking, the team discovered a campsite hidden beneath a rocky overhang. The site was well concealed, surrounded by thick brush and positioned in a way that made it nearly invisible from more than a few yards away. There was a small tarp stretched between 2 trees, a sleeping bag laid out on a bed of pine needles, and a circle of stones that had been used as a fire pit, though no fire was currently burning. Personal items were scattered around the site, including a metal cooking pot, a water filtration system, several cans of food, and a large hunting knife in a leather sheath. Next to the sleeping bag was a backpack, the same type that had been described by the postal worker. Inside the backpack, investigators found additional supplies, maps of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest with certain areas marked in pencil, and most significantly, a small digital camera. The camera was an older model, the kind used by hikers and outdoors enthusiasts before smartphones became common. When investigators turned it on, the battery was low but still functional. The screen displayed a directory of stored images. What they found on that camera would become some of the most disturbing evidence in the entire case. The photographs showed Nina and Rebecca Harlow at various stages of their captivity. In some images they were tied to trees, their faces gaunt and streaked with dirt. In others they were sitting on the ground, bound and clearly exhausted. The photos were not explicit or sexual in nature, but they were deeply unsettling because of what they represented. They were documentation, records kept by someone who viewed his victims as specimens. Each image was time-stamped, and investigators were able to create a timeline of the sisters' captivity based on the metadata. The earliest photo was dated September 11, 2021, the day after the sisters had gone missing. The most recent was dated December 9, just 2 days before they were found. The photographs confirmed everything that Nina and Rebecca had described. They also confirmed that Vincent Lowell had kept them captive for the entire 3-month period and had documented their suffering in a methodical, detached manner. But Lowell himself was not at the campsite. The sleeping bag was cold, and there were no fresh tracks leading away from the area. It appeared that he had been there recently, possibly within the last day or two, but had left before the search team arrived. A perimeter was established around the site, and additional units were called in to expand the search. Helicopters swept the surrounding ridges, and tracking teams fanned out in all directions. The snow made tracking easier in some ways as any movement would leave visible marks, but it also made the search slower and more dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature continued to drop. The search teams rotated in shifts to avoid frostbite and exhaustion. By nightfall, there was still no sign of Lowell. The decision was made to maintain a presence in the area overnight, with teams stationed at key points to prevent him from slipping past them. Portable lights were set up, and thermal imaging equipment was kept running throughout the night. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on December 29th, one of the thermal cameras picked up a heat signature moving slowly through the trees about half a mile east of the campsite. The operator immediately radioed the information to the ground teams, and a group of 6 officers moved quietly toward the location. They advanced carefully, using night vision equipment and communicating through hand signals to avoid alerting the suspect. As they closed the distance, they could see a figure moving through the underbrush. The person was tall, heavily built, and carrying a large pack. The officers called out, identifying themselves as law enforcement and ordering the individual to stop and show his hands. The figure froze for a moment, then dropped the pack and began to run. The officers pursued, their boots crunching through the snow as they gave chase. The terrain was treacherous, filled with fallen logs, rocks, and uneven ground. The suspect was fast and agile, moving through the forest with the ease of someone who had spent years navigating it. But the officers had numbers and equipment on their side. One of the deputies, a younger officer named Travis Morrow, managed to cut off the suspect's path by circling around a stand of trees. When the suspect emerged into a small clearing, Morrow was waiting. He shouted again for the man to stop and get on the ground. The man hesitated, breathing hard, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. Then, slowly he raised his hands and dropped to his knees. Officers converged on him, weapons drawn, ordering him to lie flat and place his hands behind his head. He complied without resistance. As the officers secured him with handcuffs, they pulled back his hood and shone a flashlight on his face. It was Vincent Lowell. The resemblance to the composite sketch was unmistakable. The thick beard, the deep-set eyes, the weathered skin. He stared up at the officers with an expression that was neither fearful nor defiant. It was blank, emotionless, the same look that Nina and Rebecca had described. Deputy Finch arrived at the scene 20 minutes later. He looked down at the man in handcuffs and felt a surge of relief mixed with anger. This was the person who had tormented 2 innocent women for 3 months, who had left them to die in the cold, who had treated them like objects in some twisted personal experiment. Lowell was read his rights and transported under heavy guard to the Skamania County Jail. He did not speak during the ride, did not ask for a lawyer, did not protest his arrest. He simply sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window at the dark forest passing by. Back at the campsite, forensic teams continued their work. In addition to the camera, they found notebooks filled with handwritten entries. The entries were not a diary in the traditional sense, but rather observational notes. Lowell had recorded details about the sisters' physical condition, their responses to deprivation, their emotional states. He had written about how long they could go without food, how their bodies reacted to cold, how their will to resist diminished over time. It read like a field report, clinical and detached. One entry, dated November 18th, described how Rebecca had stopped speaking altogether and how Nina had become delirious, talking to herself and seeing things that were not there. Lowell had noted these observations without any indication of empathy or guilt. To him, they were simply data points. The notebooks were entered into evidence, along with the camera, the maps, and all other materials found at the site. The case against Vincent Lowell was building rapidly, and it was clear that the evidence was overwhelming. But there was still one question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Why had he left the sisters tied to that tree and walked away? Why, after 3 months of keeping them captive, had he not finished what he had started? The answer, if there was one, would have to come from Lowell himself. We're getting close to the end of this harrowing story. If you've made it this far, you need to see how it all concludes. Make sure to stay until the very end, and share this video so others can hear this incredible story of survival. Vincent Lowell's first formal interrogation took place on the afternoon of December 29, 2021, in an interview room at the Skamania County Jail. He had been in custody for less than 12 hours, and already the weight of evidence against him was substantial. The digital camera, the notebooks, the campsite, the testimony of the sisters, all of it pointed to a man who had committed one of the most disturbing crimes in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Deputy Lawrence Finch led the interrogation, accompanied by FBI Special Agent Karen Durst, who specialized in crimes involving abduction and psychological manipulation. The session was recorded on video, and a transcript was prepared for use in the eventual trial. Lowell sat across the table from them, his hands cuffed in front of him, his expression as empty as it had been when he was arrested. He had been offered a lawyer, but he declined. He said he did not need one because he had nothing to hide. That statement alone was chilling, given the nature of the evidence already collected. Finch began by asking Lowell to confirm his identity and his recent whereabouts. Lowell answered in a flat, monotone voice. He confirmed that his name was Vincent Andrew Lowell, that he was 52 years old, and that he had been living in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest for the better part of 6 years. He said he preferred the forest to towns or cities because people were unpredictable and annoying. The forest, he said, made sense. It had rules. It had order. When asked about Nina and Rebecca Harlow, Lowell did not deny knowing who they were. He acknowledged that he had encountered them on the night of September 10, 2021, and that he had taken them from their campsite. He described the event in the same clinical, detached manner that characterized his notebook entries. He said he had been observing the campsite for several hours before approaching, waiting until he was certain they were asleep. He explained that he had used a flashlight to disorient them and zip ties to restrain them because it was efficient and minimized the risk of injury. When Finch asked why he had taken them, Lowell paused for the first time. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to explain something that should have been obvious. Then he said, "I wanted to see what would happen." Agent Durst pressed him on this. She asked what he meant by that, what he was trying to learn. Lowell's answer was disturbing in its simplicity. He said he had always been curious about human endurance, about how long a person could survive under extreme conditions without food, water, or comfort. He said that books and documentaries only provided so much information, and that he wanted to conduct his own research. He viewed Nina and Rebecca not as people, but as subjects in an experiment. He had controlled every variable, the amount of food and water they received, the temperature and exposure they endured, the psychological stress of isolation and restraint. He had documented everything, he said, because documentation was important for understanding the results. Finch asked him directly if he understood that what he had done was wrong, that he had caused immense suffering to two innocent people. Lowell looked at him with those cold, empty eyes and said that he understood society would view it that way, but that he personally did not see it as wrong. He said that suffering was a natural part of existence, and that his experiment was no different from what nature itself imposed on living creatures every day. He compared himself to a scientist studying animals in the wild, observing their behavior without interfering beyond the scope of the study. The detectives exchanged a glance. They had dealt with many criminals over the years, but Lowell was different. He was not angry, not remorseful, not trying to justify his actions in moral terms. He simply did not register the humanity of his victims. To him, they were objects, and his actions were a form of research. Agent Durst shifted the line of questioning. She asked Lowell why he had abandoned the sisters at the tree instead of continuing his experiment or disposing of them entirely. This question seemed to catch Lowell off guard. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the corner of the room. Then he said that the experiment had reached its conclusion. He explained that by early December, both women had deteriorated to the point where he believed they would not survive much longer. Their bodies were shutting down, their responses to stimuli were minimal, and he had collected all the data he needed. He said he considered ending their lives to complete the study, but decided against it. When asked why, he said he was not interested in death itself, only in the process leading up to it. Once that process was complete, the subjects no longer held any value to him. So he tied them securely to the tree, ensured they could not escape, and left. He said he assumed they would die within a day or two, and that their bodies would eventually be found, but that by then he would be long gone. He admitted that he had not anticipated they would be discovered while still alive, and that this outcome had surprised him. Finch asked Lowell if he felt anything when he learned that the sisters had survived. Lowell shook his head. He said he felt curiosity, perhaps, about how their bodies had managed to endure beyond his expectations, but nothing else. No relief, no guilt, no satisfaction. Just mild curiosity. The interrogation continued for several more hours, with Lowell providing details about the locations where he had held the sisters, the methods he had used to avoid detection, and the timeline of events over the 3-month period. He answered every question calmly and thoroughly, treating the session as if it were an academic discussion rather than a criminal investigation. He showed no signs of remorse, no recognition of the pain he had caused, and no concern for the consequences he would face. By the end of the session, it was clear to everyone in the room that Vincent Lowell was not going to offer any kind of apology or explanation that would make sense to a normal person. He existed in a mental space where human life had no intrinsic value, where suffering was merely a data point, and where his actions were justified by his own twisted sense of intellectual curiosity. The case against Vincent Lowell moved forward quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, and his own confession left no room for doubt. He was formally charged with 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 2 counts of assault in the first degree, and 2 counts of attempted murder. Additional charges were added related to the use of restraints, the infliction of psychological trauma, and the violation of federal laws governing crimes committed on public lands. The trial took place in the spring of 2022, in the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington. The proceedings were closely followed by local and national media, and the courtroom was filled with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who wanted to see justice served. Nina and Rebecca Harlow both testified, describing in painful detail the 3 months they had spent in captivity. Their testimony was emotional and compelling, and there were moments when even the judge had to pause the proceedings to allow them time to compose themselves. They described the physical agony of being bound for weeks on end, the mental torment of not knowing if they would ever be found, and the slow, creeping realization that they were going to die alone in the forest. But they also spoke about the strength they had drawn from each other, the whispered words of encouragement, the shared determination to survive one more day. The prosecution presented the photographs from Lowell's camera, the entries from his notebooks, and the forensic evidence collected from the crime scene and his campsite. Expert witnesses testified about the severity of the injuries the sisters had sustained, the medical improbability of their survival, and the psychological impact of prolonged captivity and torture. The defense, which Lowell had eventually agreed to accept after being advised by the court, attempted to argue that he suffered from a mental disorder that impaired his ability to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. A psychiatrist testified that Lowell displayed traits consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder and possible schizoid tendencies. However, the prosecution countered with their own expert, who stated that while Lowell certainly had profound psychological abnormalities, he was fully aware of what he was doing and had taken deliberate steps to avoid detection, which demonstrated a clear understanding that his actions were criminal. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. On April 14, 2022, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs and sighs of relief as the verdict was read. Nina and Rebecca, sitting in the front row with their mother, held each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Sentencing took place 2 weeks later. The judge, a veteran of the federal bench named Honorable Thomas Langford, delivered a statement before announcing the sentence. He said that in his 30 years on the bench, he had never encountered a case that so starkly illustrated the capacity for human cruelty. He noted that Vincent Lowell had treated two human beings as if they were laboratory animals, subjecting them to unimaginable suffering for no reason other than his own curiosity. He said that the only appropriate response was to ensure that Lowell would never have the opportunity to harm another person again. Vincent Lowell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively. In total, he received 6 life sentences. He showed no reaction as the sentence was read. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a piece of information, and was led out of the courtroom by federal marshals. In the months following the trial, Nina and Rebecca Harlow began the long process of recovery. Both underwent extensive physical therapy to regain strength and mobility in their limbs, which had been severely damaged by the prolonged restraint. They also participated in trauma counseling, working with specialists who helped them process the psychological wounds left by their ordeal. Their mother, Patricia, became an advocate for missing persons and wilderness safety, working with National Park Services to improve communication systems and search protocols. She also established a foundation in her daughters' names to support survivors of abduction and violent crime. Nina eventually returned to her work as a graphic designer, though she admitted in interviews that she no longer felt comfortable in isolated places. Rebecca took a leave of absence from her teaching position but eventually returned to the classroom, saying that her students gave her a reason to focus on the future rather than the past. Both sisters spoke publicly about their experience, not to relive the trauma, but to help others understand the importance of vigilance, the resilience of the human spirit, and the need for communities to support survivors. The case of Nina and Rebecca Harlow became a reference point for law enforcement agencies across the country, studied in training programs as an example of how quickly a routine outing can turn into a nightmare, and how critical it is to maintain search efforts even when hope seems lost. The fact that the sisters were found alive after 3 months against all odds was attributed to a combination of sheer will, the chance discovery by a wildlife biologist, and the meticulous investigative work that followed. Vincent Lowell remains incarcerated in a federal maximum security facility, where he spends his days in isolation. He has never expressed remorse for his actions, and according to prison records, he spends most of his time reading scientific journals and writing in notebooks that are regularly confiscated and reviewed by prison officials. He has never attempted to contact the Harlow family, and they have made it clear they have no interest in hearing from him. The forest where the sisters were held has returned to its quiet, indifferent state. The tree where they were found still stands, a silent witness to their suffering and survival. Hikers occasionally pass by it, unaware of the horror that unfolded there. But for those who know the story, it serves as a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, darkness can hide, and that the strength to endure can be found in the most unlikely circumstances. Nina and Rebecca Harlow survived because they refused to give up, because they held on to each other, and because somewhere deep in the cold, unforgiving wilderness, a fragment of hope remained alive. And in the end, that was enough.